Chicago, we've got a small piece of business news today that actually tells us a whole lot about how this coaching staff plans to use one of the most stacked tight end rooms in the entire NFL. What's up, everybody? Fave here, back with Faves, and today we're talking about tight end Sam Roush officially signing his 4-year rookie contract, plus what this means now that every single one of this year's draft picks is locked up and heading into training camp. Two pieces of news, but I think together they actually paint a really clear picture of how this front office is thinking about roster building heading into a season with real expectations. Let's get into it. So the news itself is pretty straightforward. The Bears officially announced Friday that Sam Roush has signed his 4-year rookie deal. Not exactly the kind of headline that gets the whole fan base buzzing on its own, but stick with me here because the context around this signing is genuinely interesting, and I think it tells us a lot about what Ben Johnson is planning to do with this offense. Let's rewind for a second to draft weekend, because when Chicago selected Roush in the 3rd round back in April, it caught a lot of people off guard. Here's a team that already has Colston Loveland, a former first-round pick who just put together the best rookie tight end receiving season in franchise history, and Cole Kmet, a proven veteran who's still one of the better blocking tight ends in this league. So the immediate reaction from a lot of fans and analysts was, why would you use a 3rd round? Roush was genuinely one of the bigger standouts of this entire offseason program, and it's become pretty clear the Bears have real specific plans for him as a rookie, even walking into a tight end room that's already loaded with talent. Let's talk about what that role actually looks like, because I don't think Roush is walking in expecting to be some kind of major factor in the passing game right away, and honestly, that's fine. That's not really what this signing is about. With Loveland and Kmet already commanding targets at tight end, plus receivers like Rome Odunze and Luther Burden III soaking up plenty of volume in the passing attack, there simply isn't a ton of room left over for a rookie tight end to carve out a significant receiving role in year one. But where I think Roush is going to genuinely matter is as a blocker. His prowess in that phase of the game is exactly why this front office and coaching staff valued him as highly as they did on draft weekend, and given how much Ben Johnson has shown he loves running heavier personnel groupings, we're talking about 12 and 13 personnel packages with multiple tight ends on the field at once, Roush should get real. Meaningful playing time as a rookie regardless of how involved he is as a pass catcher. Let's dig a little deeper into who Roush actually is as a prospect, because I think that context matters here. He comes out of Stanford, where he built a reputation as one of the more physical, technically sound blocking tight ends in this entire draft class. That's not always the flashiest skill set to sell to NFL evaluators. Teams and draft media tend to fixate on catch totals and yards after the catch when they're grading tight ends. But if you talk to actual offensive coaches around this league, they'll tell you a tight end who can consistently win at the point of attack in the run game and hold up against NFL caliber edge defenders in pass. Protection is an incredibly valuable and increasingly rare commodity. That's exactly the profile Roush brings to Chicago, and it's exactly the kind of player a scheme built around multiple tight end formations actually needs to function at a high level. It's also worth noting that his standout performance throughout this offseason program wasn't just buzz for the sake of buzz. It reportedly showed up specifically in how quickly he picked up the details of this scheme, understanding blocking assignments, communicating protections, and adjusting to different fronts. For a rookie coming into a room with 2 established tight ends already ahead of him on the depth chart, that kind of quick processing matters just as much as the physical tools, because it's what allows a coaching staff to trust a young player with real playing time before he's fully proven himself in live NFL games. There's also something to be said for the timing of when a team chooses to develop a player like this. Some rookies get thrown into the fire immediately out of necessity, forced to play significant snaps before they're really ready simply because the roster doesn't have better options available. Roush is in a much more favorable developmental situation. He gets to learn behind 2 established veterans, absorb the offense at a manageable pace, and earn his snaps gradually rather than being forced into a role he isn't prepared for. That's actually a genuinely valuable position for a rookie to be in, because it usually leads to a more polished, more confident player by year 2 and year 3, rather than one who got rushed and picked up bad habits trying to survive early playing time he wasn't ready for. And here's the part of this that I find genuinely exciting looking ahead. If Roush has an impactful rookie season purely in that blocking role, he's not just some depth piece sitting at the bottom of the roster. He's a legitimate candidate to eventually push Cole Kmet for that TE2 spot in this offense. Now, I want to be clear, that's not happening this year. Kmet's blocking ability and his overall experience in this offense still make him the clear TE2 heading into the 2026 season. But if Roush shows out during camp and continues developing the way this staff clearly believes he can, that's a real competition worth watching over the next year or two. And it fits into a pattern we've actually talked about on this channel before regarding how this front office is thinking about the tight end position long term. Let's talk about Loveland for a second too, because his rookie season is really the backdrop that makes this entire Roush signing make sense in the first place. Loveland put together 58 catches as a rookie, with 47 of those coming over his final 10 regular season games once he really settled into this offense. Project that closing stretch pace over a full 16 or 17 game season, and you're talking about somewhere close to 80 catches and over 1,000 receiving yards from the tight end position alone. That is an enormous receiving workload for one player at that spot, and it fundamentally changes how this coaching staff has to think about roster construction around him. When you've got a tight end producing at that level as a pure receiving weapon, you don't need a second or third tight end who's also trying to be a receiving threat. You actually create more value by surrounding him with complementary pieces who excel at exactly what he isn't primarily being used for. That's the entire logic behind bringing in a blocking specialist like Roush rather than another pass-catching tight end who'd just be competing for the same targets Loveland is already commanding. Think about the bigger investment picture here for a second, because I think it's worth connecting some dots. The Bears used a top 10 pick on Colston Loveland just last year. They've now used a third-round pick on Sam Roush this year, and Cole Kmet is still working through a contract situation of his own that could get complicated down the road as his cap number climbs in 2027. When you stack that many resources into one single position group across back-to-back draft classes, that's not an accident. That's a clear organizational statement about how important the tight end position is going to be in Ben Johnson's offense moving forward. This isn't a team drafting for depth just to have bodies on the roster. This is a team deliberately building out a position group that they believe can be a real weapon, whether that's through receiving production like Loveland already showed as a rookie, or through the physical blocking-oriented role that Roush appears to be walking into. If you've been following our coverage of this roster closely, you already know we've talked before about how Kmet's situation could evolve as this front office continues investing more draft capital at his position. His cap hit climbs significantly in 2027, and with Loveland already handling the receiving workload at an elite level, and Roush now added specifically to handle blocking duties, the front office is quietly building a scenario where Kmet's role and eventually his roster spot could come under real pressure if the younger options continue developing the way this staff believes they will. I want to be clear, none of that is happening in 2026. Kmet remains firmly entrenched as the TE2 heading into this season, and his experience and blocking ability still carry real value on this roster right now. But the long-term trajectory here is worth watching closely, and Roush's signing is another data point in that broader story. I also think it's worth pointing out how well this fits with what we already know about Ben Johnson's offensive philosophy coming over from Detroit. Multiple tight end sets create real matchup problems for opposing defenses because you can disguise run and pass looks out of the exact same personnel grouping, forcing a defense to guess rather than substitute based on what they see lining up. If Chicago can roll out Loveland, Kmet, and eventually Roush in various combinations depending on the situation, that gives Ben Johnson an enormous amount of flexibility to dictate matchups rather than react to whatever the defense throws at him. That's exactly the kind of scheme diversity that makes an offense difficult to prepare for on a week-to-week basis, and it's a big reason I think this front office was comfortable investing another premium pick into a position that already looked crowded on paper. Think about how this actually plays out on a given Sunday. If you've got Loveland split out wide or in the slot as a legitimate receiving threat, Kmet in line handling a tough matchup against an edge defender, and Roush coming in on rundowns to add an extra gap in the running game, opposing defensive coordinators have to prepare for essentially three different skill sets out of what looks pre-snap, like the exact same grouping. That forces a defense to either commit extra resources to stopping the run, which opens up the play action game that Ben Johnson has built his reputation on, or spread out to match potential receiving threats, which creates natural running lanes for a backfield that already features DeAndre Swift and Kyle Monangai. That's the entire point of stacking resources at one position group the way this front office has. It's not about redundancy, it's about flexibility. We saw a version of exactly this kind of scheme diversity work at an extremely high level in Detroit before Ben Johnson ever got to Chicago, and it's a big reason his name generated so much head coaching interest around the league before the Bears ultimately landed him. Bringing that same philosophy here and building out the personnel to properly execute it is a clear sign of continuity in how he wants to build this offense long term. It's also worth thinking about how this connects to the offensive line pieces that make heavy personnel packages actually work in the first place. A 12 or 13 personnel look with multiple tight ends only creates the matchup problems we just talked about. If your offensive line can consistently win the run game snaps that come with it, otherwise a defense simply loads the box and dares you to run into a wall. That's exactly why the continued investment up front, guys like Joe Thuney, Jonah Jackson, and the development of Braxton Jones and Ozzie Traplow that we've covered extensively on this channel matters just as much to Roush's role as the tight end position itself does. You can draft all the blocking tight ends you want, but if the offensive line in front of him isn't holding up its end of the bargain, those heavier personnel groupings stop being a weapon and start being a liability. The fact that this front office has invested so heavily in both the offensive line and now a blocking tight end in the same general time frame tells you this is a coordinated plan, not a series of disconnected roster moves. And that's really the piece that ties this entire offseason together when you step back and look at it as a whole. This isn't a front office chasing individual splashy headlines, whether that's a big free agent name or a first-round pick generating buzz on draft night. This is an organization methodically building complementary pieces around a core group of established players. Offensive line depth to support the run game, a blocking tight end to make heavier personnel packages viable, secondary and defensive line depth to withstand the grind of a full season. None of it makes for a single dramatic headline on its own, but stacked together across an entire offseason, it paints the picture of a team that's genuinely building towards sustained contention rather than just a single good year. Now let's zoom out a little bit, because Roush's signing actually closes out a bigger storyline for this organization heading into training camp. With his contract now official, every single one of the Bears' 2026 draft picks is officially under contract and ready to report. That full class includes safety Dylan Thieneman, center Logan Jones, Sam Roush, wide receiver Xavier Thomas, cornerback Malik Muhammad, linebacker Keyshawn Elliott, and defensive tackle Jordan Vandenberg. That's 7 picks across both sides of the ball, all locked in and accounted for before camp even officially opens later this month. I think it's worth taking a second to appreciate how smoothly this front office continues to handle these rookie contract negotiations. We don't hear about holdouts. We don't hear about drawn-out negotiations dragging into the start of camp. These deals get done efficiently, and every single draft selection is able to show up on time and get fully immersed in this offense and defense from day one. That might sound like a small administrative thing, but it actually matters a great deal for player development. Every single day a rookie spends away from the building because of a contract dispute is a day of reps and installation he doesn't get back. And for a coaching staff that's trying to develop this much young talent across the roster at once, having every single pick under contract and ready to go before camp starts is a real, tangible advantage. This matters even more given the rookie wage scale system that's been in place across the league for over a decade now. Rookie contracts are largely slotted based on draft position, which means there isn't a ton of actual negotiating room compared to the old days when first-round holdouts could drag deep into August. But even within that structure, some organizations still manage to create unnecessary friction, whether it's over offset language, guarantee structures, or roster bonus language buried in the fine print. The fact that Chicago's front office consistently gets these deals done cleanly and quickly year after year speaks to a well-run football operations department that isn't looking to nickel and dime its own draft picks over minor contract language. That kind of organizational competence rarely gets talked about publicly, but it's exactly the sort of thing that keeps a locker room functioning smoothly and keeps young players focused on football instead of contract disputes. Let's run through this class for a second, because I think it says something about the overall approach this front office is taking with roster construction this year. You've got Thuney adding depth and competition in the secondary at safety, a player who profiles as exactly the kind of instinctive ball-hawking defender that can push for real early playing time in sub-packages, even as a rookie. You've got Logan Jones coming in to compete at center, adding depth behind Drew Dalman at a position group that benefited enormously from continuity last season, but where you always want a capable backup ready to step in, given how much wear and tear the interior of the offensive line takes over a full season. You've got Sam Roush bringing that blocking presence we just talked about at tight end. Xavier Thomas gives this receiver room another developmental option behind the established names already on the roster, a player this coaching staff can bring along at his own pace behind Odunze, Burden, and the rest of that talented receiver room. Malik Muhammad adds competition and depth at cornerback, a position that always benefits from adding multiple bodies given how demanding it is physically over a full season, and given the reality that cornerback depth tends to get tested by injuries more than almost any other position group on a roster. Keyshawn Elliott brings athleticism to the linebacker room, giving this defense another option who could potentially factor into coverage responsibilities as the scheme continues evolving under Dennis Allen. And Jordan Vandenberg adds interior defensive line depth, which, if you watched our video breaking down the Vita Vea speculation, you already know is a spot this coaching staff continues to keep an eye on strengthening, whether that ends up coming through the draft, free agency, or potentially a trade down the road. It's worth pointing out, too, that this class skews heavily toward exactly the kind of positions where depth tends to get tested hardest over the course of a long season: secondary, offensive and defensive line, and the trenches in general. That's not a coincidence. That's a front office that's clearly studied where injuries and attrition tend to hit hardest and made sure this rookie class was built to provide real, usable depth at those exact spots rather than just accumulating talent for talent's sake. When you look at a roster that's trying to sustain a real playoff push over 17 games plus a potential postseason run, having capable NFL-ready depth at cornerback and along both lines isn't a luxury, it's a necessity, and this draft class was clearly constructed with that reality in mind. Spread across that many different position groups, this isn't a draft class built around one single splashy pick. It's a class built around adding competition and depth practically everywhere on the roster. And when you combine that kind of across-the-board investment with the fact that every single one of these picks is now signed, sealed, and ready to compete in training camp, I think it sets this coaching staff up really well to evaluate exactly what they have heading into final roster cuts. Bringing it back to Sam Roush specifically, because I don't want to lose the thread on why this individual signing actually matters beyond just being an administrative box checked off the list. This is a player that Ben Johnson clearly wanted in a draft class where the Bears could have gone in a lot of different directions with that third-round selection. The fact that they chose to double down at tight end, a position where they already had significant investment in place, tells you this coaching staff has a very specific vision for how they want to deploy multiple tight end personnel groupings this season, and they were willing to spend real draft capital to make sure they had the personnel to execute that vision. I'll be honest, when I first saw this pick back in April, I had some of the same questions a lot of you probably did. Why invest another premium selection into a position that already looked pretty well accounted for? But the more context that's come out since then, particularly around how much Roush stood out during this offseason program and how clearly this pick reflects Ben Johnson's specific scheme preferences, the more sense it makes. This isn't a redundant pick. This is a coaching staff building out exactly the kind of personnel flexibility they want available heading into a season with real expectations attached to it. There's also a broader lesson here about how modern NFL roster building actually works that I think gets lost sometimes in the way we talk about the draft. Fans, and honestly a lot of media too, tend to evaluate every single pick purely through the lens of the top of the depth chart. Is this guy going to start? Is he going to be a difference maker immediately? But real roster construction, the kind that sustains success over multiple seasons rather than just one flashy year, happens through exactly these kinds of moves. Identifying scheme-specific role players who might not grab headlines in year one, but who fill a genuine functional need and provide insurance against injury or decline elsewhere on the roster. Roush might never become a household name outside of Chicago, but if he does his job well within this specific offensive system, he becomes exactly the kind of quietly valuable piece that good football teams are built on. I've seen some of the fan reaction to this pick since draft weekend, and I get why some of you are still skeptical. Spending anything higher than a late round flyer on a third tight end when you already have two established talented options ahead of him on the depth chart can look like a wasted resource if you're only thinking about this year. But I'd push back on that framing a little bit. Roster building isn't just about year one. It's about building sustainable depth and scheme fit that pays off over multiple seasons. Kmet's long-term outlook with this roster isn't entirely settled given his cap trajectory. Injuries happen at every position, including tight end, and having a young, cost-controlled player who's already shown he can pick up this scheme quickly is exactly the kind of insurance policy that smart front offices build in before they actually need it, not after.